Ahsoka, Balance of Truth, Book 2. Chapter 15. She stood in the austere corridor, straightening her uniform jacket with simultaneous downward tugs, eyeing her dark rank insignia as it caught the light from above the gallery doorway she stood before. "Always room for more," she said without a care who may have been listening. Deciding she kept those within the chambers waiting long enough, she turned the corners of her mouth downward and lifted her chin slightly, adopting the severe expression they would all expect. She slipped her code cylinder into a small notch at waist level in the access terminal and welcomed the inrush of expectation as the doorway slid open with a sharp hiss. "Waiting on me, were you?" Slamming hands on thick wooden tables assured her that the ploy had the desired effect. "Director Isard, for the 18 minutes you've kept us waiting. 18 minutes is infinitely intolerable. Is it your mindset that the Empire come to a screeching halt to wait on you?" The haughty voice of Masameda called as she entered the room, the fleshy blue lethorns twitching as they dangled over his fists, the tension palpable in the air. Ysanne Isard elongated her form as she cracked a smile, striding formally toward the central seat in the middle of the sterile chamber. She had plenty of retaliatory comments prepared for this instance, her mind already working on the next move. Still, she knew the self-indulged Shagrian would boil over with anger if she said nothing, and ignored him outright. "Gentlemen, if you would please take your seats. As you know, we have a tight schedule to maintain," Ysanne said in her most distinguished voice, conveying power, yet preferred thoughts of self-suggestion. Glancing toward Masameda, she offered a hand toward his seat, prompting the Grand Vizier to quake on the spot, his lethorns vibrating as if they had a mind of their own. She waited a few seconds longer as the Shagrian visibly fumed his displeasure. "If you prefer to stand, Vizier," she said, tossing her hand in the air, a dismissive action that mirrored her nonverbal intentions. "In the interest of avoiding verbal sport, it is my ambition to merge both intelligence conglomerates into a single entity." Barton Coburn did his best to stifle a laugh, failing admirably. "Director Isard, as I am director on an interim basis only, I am sure my opinion will carry little to no weight. That being said, there is a damn good reason the two agencies have remained separate entities for as long as they have." His gravelly voice echoed through the small auditorium chamber. Janus Grijatis half stood with his hand raised. "Hear, hear, Director Coburn. Asserting control of Imperial intelligence to a sole source is foolhardy at best, contrary to what these institutions represent in the first place." Ysanne couldn't stand the man. She wasn't sure anyone outside the Emperor could. Slimy, grotesque, and inconsequential in her estimation. "Not all institutions can afford the luxury of operating outside the constraints of protocol, Vizier Grijatis," she said, addressing his comment directly, her eyes drawn narrow. "Now, I do understand the need for accountability through the various chains of command," she began anew, turning her attention toward Director Coburn, this time adopting a half-smile as she widened her eyes, yet saw the head shake peripherally from Grijatis. She was in her element. "This is all pointless banter. His Excellency has already approved the appointment of Deputy Director Audenhone," Masameda spoke up. Ysanne smirked as she turned slowly toward the garishly clad Grand Vizier. "Providing he identifies and subsequently dispatches the source of the signal intrusion," she said in return, her exotic eyes narrowing again as a lock of silvery white hair graced her cheek. His reaction was priceless, she thought, a mixture of both seething anger and startled surprise. "Rest assured, Grand Vizier, I am very good at my job." She made sure he saw the smirk this time. Barton Coburn didn't even attempt to hold back the laughter this time. "Your ambition knows no bounds, Director. Of that, I am sure we can all agree. Much like your father, I would add. I am sure he would be proud." The comment was as genuine as he was. Ysanne bit the inside of her lip to keep a sudden surge of anger from lashing forth. "I am nothing like my short-sighted father," she thought, calming herself in the process. My ambition is boundless, Director Coburn, all for the good of our empire. Careful, Director, Kinman Doriana hissed the words, directed toward Ysanne. Now you're sounding like Tarkin. His timing was perfect as she glanced toward him, wondering if there was a script she had missed in her briefing. An honor indeed to hold such esteem. Thank you, Advisor Doriana, she said with a gracious bow in his direction. She was confident it was the furthest thing from a compliment, but she took it as one just the same. Governor Tarkin, had he been granted his request from the start, would most definitely not have suffered such an incendiary demise, she added, again silently thanking the sallow man, who may have been attractive some 40 years ago. Gentlemen, that is the point. She pressed the advantage as everyone else held their tongue. The more time we spend bickering over shared power or satiating ego, the closer our enemies come to succeeding in destroying what our Emperor has created. She paused briefly, again knowing none would argue the point on any level. A consolidated intelligence bureau, combining the might of MI and the scope of ISB, would create the single largest well of knowledge this galaxy has ever seen. Barton Coburn coughed briefly. Well said, Director. I, for one, have agreed with your fundamental assessment from day one, whatever the case. There is no greater power than that of knowledge, and being able to act on that knowledge. However, my misgivings lie with the benefactor of that power. He paused to clear his throat, raising a finger to convey he had more to add. He tried in vain to resume his narrative, but a fit of coughing took him once again. Well now, Barton, it almost sounds as though you're endorsing this initiative, Masameda chimed in. Ysanne rolled her eyes as she turned to the interim director fully. Grijatis stood from his seat. And what of Audenholm? He seemed eager enough to take on the role. Janice, the man was only eager to take on the field assignment. He'd hate this job in truth. After regaining his lost breath, Coburn turned his wizened gaze upon the sickly man. Janice only looked at him quizzically, opening his mouth as if to ask why. Why didn't he turn it down outright? Because he's no fool, Janice, and I'll leave it at that. Coburn answered the unasked question, his skin flushing as he broke into a coughing spasm yet again. Ysanne was positively ecstatic on the inside, laying her initiative out in plain language and so freely to be heard by everyone within the room and those monitoring externally. The expected bickering was taking them all entirely off topic. Whether or not she could lay the framework for direct control of the sum of Imperial intelligence would not be in doubt. She knew Palpatine would either see, or at the very least hear, her words. If there was any doubt to be sown, it came from his own advisors and viziers. Perfect, she thought, watching Doriana and Grijatis point fingers toward Coburn. Coburn himself seized in another coughing spasm as he turned red with anger, raising a fist in Ameda's direction, spittle forming at the corners of their mouths. She watched as if in a dream, all eyes directed toward one another and away from her entirely. The sounds of raised voices, outright shouting, and personal threats faded as her internal smile broadened. This is why you fail, she thought again silently. You're all too concerned about legacy and not enough about progress. She finished the thought with a brief headshake. Her eyes drifted to the sole attendee who had yet to utter a word as the chaotic din subsided within her mind. Seated in the uppermost row, overlooking the rest, sat Saint Pestage. A simple woven cream-colored robe and cowl pulled over his shaved head, blended in spectacularly with the stark white interior of the chamber. Although most of his face was hidden beneath the hood, Ysanne could see the smile on the man's face and the telltale bob of his head. She did her best to contain her elation as she saw the up and down motions, the smile broaden, and the man clasp his hands together in mock applause. The sole benefactor of her admiration within the entirety of the Emperor's cadre, he had covertly taken her under his wing some time ago. Ysanne broke her gaze from Pestage as the sounds of rushed anger, heated debate, and spewing vitriol renewed their audio assault. Gentlemen, she had to repeat with more enthusiasm. as if there were any question as to why our Emperor considered it best to eliminate the Senate. She shouted with raised hands, at least getting the attention of those gathered due to the hue of the uniform, if not her words. "Do you hear yourselves?" she added as the bickering died down to slight murmurs, Coburn and Grijatis returning to their seats. Instead of entertaining thoughts of a ploy and taking this initiative directly to the Emperor, I thought it best to bring the matter to this body for lively debate and insight, rather than narcissistic sarcasm, finger-pointing and flushing anger. She said pointedly, the words sharp yet refined. She panned the men with her gaze, focusing both red and blue eyes on each of them individually, framed by silvery white locks of hair cascading over either cheek. Grijatis was the first to speak. "Apologies for the affront, Mistress Isard. Director, if you will," she interjected. "I give you the respect of title advisor. I expect that to be reciprocated." The words were icy daggers. "Director," he corrected himself. "I think I speak for those assembled that your initiative, although bold, is inherently dangerous in scope," he began anew, adopting a calm demeanor and steady voice. "Certain elements will be construed as self-serving, regardless of the intent for one. 2. Certain elements within the purpose of ISB were installed to hold MI accountable, and vice versa." Ysanne, although patience intact, stewed internally. They can't see the stars through the star field, she thought. "And what of Grand General Tagg?" Doriana interjected. "We cannot possibly entertain a solution without his input on the matter." Ysanne glanced toward the upper row again, catching a slight nod from Pestage. "He is occupied in the Kuat system presently," she responded, noting the affirmative nod from Coburn in verification. However, his return is doubtful, she thought, knowing she could never utter the words aloud. "His reasons lie outside my purview, I am afraid." "In the interest of bringing things to a conclusion, I would only like to make one point," Grand Vizier Ameda spoke up, raising himself from his seat. "As we are only a few months removed from the example set when what can go wrong ultimately does, let me remind this body that advanced weapon research falls under the reach of MI." Everyone nodded their implied understanding. As a case in point, the late Lieutenant Commander also had stratospheric ambition, yet not the means to contain it, he continued, struggling with the designation of rank Orson Krennic had not earned in his estimation. Having had my cross-interrupted run-ins with his ego, the example was thus set for a sole individual possessing too much control over a single entity. Ysanne smiled politely and nodded her understanding to the Grand Vizier. "Yes, AWR continues to remain within our scope of responsibility, as it should. Yet using Krennic as an example is most reckless indeed." She was calculating and deliberate, yet continued politely and eloquently. The man thought himself above reproach, and ultimately paid the price for ambition gone astray of objective. She smiled both inwardly and outwardly. Director Barton Coburn began to chuckle lightly to himself, crossing his arms before his chest. As she turned toward him, Ysanne saw the twinkle in his eye and knew at least one of them was beginning to understand. "Gentlemen, I think it best to reassess our particular objections to what we've been presented, bring this back full circle and align ourselves toward a similar cause." His words seemed authentic enough to her ears, giving her enough confidence in her assumption. Tarkin's ambitions toward the completion and eventual operational status of the battle station always carried with them the underlying thread of imperial justification first and foremost. In fact, that is how he carried himself in all things, Coburn continued. "I feel I can speak openly and for everyone on that matter." He paused briefly, eyeing Ysanne quickly with a sly wink. By the time he was granted autumnal oversight, Krennic's damage had already been done. "I believe what Director Isard's request here, today, represents is an opportunity to redeem that past mistake." He looked down briefly, knowing that all in the room would have appropriate clearances for what he would offer next, but wasn't sure if they should be presented any opportunity to debate openly. "I pause only to consider the ramifications of continuation while we remain potentially exposed to external source threats." For the first time, Sate Pestinge got up from his seated position and began descending the steps toward those gathered. "There is no need for concern within these walls, Director. Speak freely." Although not entirely sure how confident he was at the word of the Emperor's most secretive advisor, Coburn also knew it was too late to reverse course. As you all know fondly, innumerable Imperial projects at various levels of secrecy are taking place as we speak. If they all fell under the same authority, they could be managed within a static system of their own checks and balances, while operating with the same efficiency. Ysanne swiveled to face Masameda. "That is the point, Grand Vizier," she said directly to him, watching as the Lethorns trilled with a slight vibration, his own eyes burning with a rage she knew he couldn't release. "Let us not forget that Krennic operated under your father's direction, Director Isard," Grijadas made a point to add. Ysanne pulled the corners of her lips downward again, inclining her neck and turning her head slowly in his direction, looking down her nose at him. "Krennic is dead, and I am not my father." With a sharp crack of thunder, far in the distance behind him, Konda began counting the seconds out in his mind. 1, 2, 3, while picking up his pace, eyeing the glimmering lights that waved on the horizon before him. A bright flash lit the sky above, cascading feverish tendrils of electricity through its expanse in all directions, and offered him a glimpse of his shadow in front of him. 23. He knew he had time to seek shelter from the approaching storm, provided he correctly calculated the distance to the settlement. The boots the clone had provided, Rex, he remembered, were a damn sight better for traversing the hard-packed ground below his feet than the issued Imperial boots that were never made for natural paths. What armor he had remaining had been removed along with the fibrous bodysuit and crammed into the pack slung over his back, as he had changed into the proffered clothing once the ship had left. The ground had descended onto the expansive plain, the soil richer as Konda's feet sank a few millimeters with every step. "Talak grass," he said to himself with a knowing smile. A severe crack pierced the silence the night brought with it to Raada as another thunderclap revealed itself. Instinctively, he began counting the seconds again, reaching 18 before the darkness was pierced with the brilliance of the finger-like lightning again, his shadow mimicking the run he adopted. Having spent enough time on the plains of Toprawa, he knew the hills and canyons only provided a slight buffer to the speed and ferocity of encroaching storms. Once it found the plains, it would resume its progression without hesitation. The blades of talak grasses ripped past the leggings of his pants. Again, Konda silently thanked the Togruta and clone alike for the gift, as they would have sawed straight through the bodysuit he had previously adorned. His jog turned into an all-out sprint as the thunder peeled the silence again. 7. The lightning gave him a snapshot of his immediate surroundings, the talak grass giving way to more natural flora he couldn't identify. The plants were aligned in rows, well-cultivated rows. He aligned his trajectory between the rows and fought his muscles to increase speed. The lights from the settlement brighter, he could identify a small, unkempt shed that became his target. The thunder striking once again. 3. He was out of time. With a last-chance effort, he pushed his aching calves past the point of excruciating pain and directly for the darkened entrance of the shed. Konda felt a pressure against his chest, some invisible force that seemed to wish for him to get caught in the storm. But it was gone just as suddenly as it was present. The silence, he thought, and pushed past his breaking point to reach the outbuilding. The wind slammed him from behind, almost taking him from his frantic feet. A glance to his side revealed the planted rows bent virtually parallel with the ground in protest. He spun his head forward again and jumped into the opening the shed provided in a clumsy mess, promptly rolling to his left to rest his back against the forward wall. At the exact moment, a torrential horizontal rain pelted the metallic roof. The wind blew through the doorway with such ferocity that the rainwater it carried peppered the ceiling above him. Konda tensed his muscles and pressed a hand to the wall directly behind him, and the one adjacent to him on the left, feeling only a slight rhythmic vibration from the storm outside, and with that, he felt secure within the structure. A deafening crack of thunder and an immediate show of bright lightning offered enough light to observe the interior of his shelter. A scattering of crude tools and small sacks on the other side of the enclosure, 3 meters away. His chest heaving rapidly, replenishing his lungs with fresh air, he began rubbing at his calves vigorously to prevent the muscles from cramping as he closed his eyes and rested his head against the wall. Although thoroughly winded and sore from head to toe from his efforts, he was sure he would be safe until the storm passed, feeling more at ease with the sight of simple farming implements and crude tools. Although he didn't regret his decision to stay on Raada, he found himself mentally exploring the possibilities remaining with the group of rebels could present. Despite his misgivings, he could genuinely see himself fighting alongside the group. Fighting what? He thought the crux of the question itself. He had only known desolate posts and cruel junior officers, but what they represented was insignificant in his estimation, inconsequential to what those rebels fought against. He looked down in the darkness, feeling the clothing wrapped around his skin, the warm, comfortable boots on his feet inside, a lament to the position he now found himself in, but in earnest, one that spoke of the futility that either side in the galactic war represented. The thought of escape was as ingenuine as it was fleeting. War doesn't provide for contingency. It is only a matter of deciphering what one will or will not do. The sound of the pelting rains, the cracking of intense thunder, and the brilliant flashes of chaotic lightning prevailed through the night. Kanda, although desperately tired, continuously prevented himself from falling asleep. At least the training was good for something, he mused as he rummaged mindlessly through the pack, feeling for something that could dampen the cold that permeated his bones. His hand briefly touched something hard, wrapped in what felt like incredibly soft leather, before his palm wrapped around the brittle material of a thermal blanket. Retrieving it, he pressed it around his sides and felt the activation his resonating body heat provided. He plunged his hand back into the pack to find the soft leather again, wrapping his hand firmly around the object. He pulled it out and brought it to his lap. Another crack of thunder and he resumed his countdown, waiting patiently for the expected lightning burst. 10. Looking down quickly, he saw the small bundle as his mind had described it to him. Soft leather wrapped tightly around a cylindrical item with leather straps at either end. As the light faded, he plied his fingers to cinch the straps to unfold the wrapping. Feeling with both hands carefully in his lap, he surmised the object was a metallic cylinder, one open and one closed end. 2 rotating dials and an inlaid pad adorned the outside of the cylinder. He dared not touch or press anything without the aid of the lightning or some other visual reference, having no idea what lay before him. A roaring crack of thunder surprised Kanda outright, causing him to smash his head into the solid wall behind him and slam his thumb into the cylinder before him. The item came to life with its own light source, an electrical gating hum against the humidity and static energy within the air as it hissed to life in his lap. A tubular beam of concentrated energy, burning a majestic purple hue, illuminated the entirety of the enclosure. "Jedi!" A voice from his right startled Kanda again, causing him to fumble momentarily with the saber's hilt. Although he had never seen one, he'd certainly heard of them, causing a brief wave of panic to rush through him, eclipsed only by his effort to keep from maiming himself with it. Once under moderate control, he spun to face the sound, finding a small child standing in the doorway. She? He couldn't tell from his vantage, and the child's appearance, and the oddity of his light source. Kanda spread his fingers wide, trying to locate the switch he had inadvertently discovered, feeling like a farmer trying to load a proton bomb for the first time. Finally, he located the switch and deactivated the saber, returning the shed to darkness once again. "I am no Jedi, child." "Did you kill one, then?" The soft voice asked. Its source had remained motionless. "A Jedi?" "No, I found this," he said truthfully, realizing the darkness had returned fully, and the child was out in it. "Where are your parents? And why are you awake? My da is exploring, Ma says. She is sweeping. I heard a bang and waked up to look. Conda did his best to assess the response. Dad ran off, Mom is cleaning, and this child is fearless. How old are you? 4? 5? There was a pause before the child spoke again. I don't know. I haven't seen 3 snows here, but we were in space before. Okay, at minimum 3. The thunder woke you up? Nope, not the storms. The ship. The child responded. Conda leaned forward to peer out the doorway, every muscle in his body fighting him for every centimeter of travel. With audible groans, he swiveled precariously on his knee to push himself up to his feet. You must be really old for so much sound to get up, the child added, Conda stifling a laugh to keep the boy from diving into further insults. Not old, just very sore. Can you show me the ship? Conda asked. A thought occurred to him. Have you seen Jedi? Yes. Sometimes Vossi comes, and so does his girlfriend. The child laughed in response. Katu! A frantic shout filled the air outside. Here, Mama! The child responded, turning his form from the shed. I found a Jedi! Oh, no. That's not good, Conda thought. Sudden visions of myriad ways this could go wrong filling his mind. He quickly packed everything he had displaced from the pack, forgot about being sore, and approached the doorway at the child's side as an adult. Iktochi rounded the corner of the adjoining building and hurried to snatch the child's hand. With the tarnished lantern in her thick-fingered grip, Conda could finally see the child clearly. A tiny human male with shaggy brown hair and dirty scraps for clothing. This is Mama? Get away from my son, the woman threatened without levy, her notable accent punctuating the directive with no room for misinterpretation. Conda spread his palms wide, raising his arms slightly while backing up a few steps into the mud the heavy rains had created, a dreary mist still clinging to the thick air. Katu, the ships have come. We must leave, she said to the child, tugging at his arm with a hasty retreat. She stopped abruptly at the corner of the building. You too, she motioned to Conda. We have to hurry. The Empire is coming. Although he had no doubts they would, he was amazed at how she knew and why they would respond so quickly. What? He managed finally, his mind suddenly swirling. No time to explain. Either come with us or die, she said hastily, her accent peculiar in his ears. How are you here? She asked upon his approach, deciding without thinking that choice wasn't a factor. What an odd question, he thought, figuring it was phrased purposefully. The only responses that came to mind were the beginnings of lousy cantina jokes or thoughtfully crafted works of fiction that would prove unbelievable. The truth sounded even crazier as he thought. I do not want to fight anymore. It was the truth. Then you were in the right place. Come, she said without asking him for any further information. Where are we? He asked. It doesn't matter, because we are leaving, she said quickly, ushering the 3 straight down the center of a road full of others sporting packs and personal belongings wherever they could fit them. Conda looked to either side of him as they increased their pace, seeing Twi'lek, Togruta, Celestin, Deveronian, Human, Mon Calamari, and Aqualish alike, rushing onward toward a planet-side freighter on its landing pads at the other end of town. A Mon Cal freighter that had seen better days. Women and children mostly, he thought it through. Refugees? It couldn't be anything else. Blaster fire ensued from the end of town they had come. He spun to see several others of differing species blasting away patches of the buildings, burning what was combustible, tossing thermal detonators into various homes, and dumping bodies. What? He almost said aloud, watching the aliens and humans combine efforts to dump bodies of the dead at random intervals. Bodies in armor. Dead stormtroopers. A fire team swept in from behind, scorching everything already destroyed in a blanket of fiery wrath. Move, new guy, or I'll have them burn you too, the Iktochi whispered into his ear. Kala, Katu's father? A newcomer interceded, tugging on the Iktochi's shoulder as they all began ascending the boarding ramp to the Mon Cal freighter. No, my boyfriend. Now mind your damn business, Ranga. In response, the Iktochi, Kala, Conda assumed, said a coarse delivery in that impeccably stimulating accent. "Thank you, Kala," Kondo whispered into what he assumed was her ear as he pressed his head close to hers, unsure if he had made the right decisions, but determined to see where this particular one took him. She didn't respond. She only shrugged as she pulled on his arm with one hand while guiding Katu toward a corner of the ship's massive cargo hold with the other. Konda spun his head like a swivel, watching everyone else herding in behind them. "Last!" he heard someone bellow from the rear as the actuators engaged on the cargo bay door. Heavy hydraulic struts pulled the ramp up quickly, the ship leaving the moon's surface before it closed with finality. A trembling vibration reminded him of the soreness of his bones as the repulsors fired in sync with the ship's massive maneuvering jets. Konda sat cross-legged on the cargo bay decking, Kala pressing up against him and Katu on her lap. The unmistakable screeching roar of twin ion engines racing past the outer hull and continuous blasts of twin laser cannon fire sent his panic levels into overdrive. Kala placed a solid, firm hand on his knee. "It is going to be all right," she said to him softly. "We are going to a better place." Konda may have settled down had she not continued speaking, but the promise of going to a better place sent his mind reeling. Had it not been for the roaring TIE fighters fading into silence or the casual demeanor of those around him, he was sure he would have lost all grip on his senses. He felt a gentle lurch as his ship entered zero gravity and watched, listening, as those who were casually speaking with relatives, one-time neighbors, and friends began to seat themselves. Species from across the galaxy in one place conversing over topics as though acquaintances for some time. How to transport pufferbigs, how to mate calyx, debating the soil constitutions after the introduction of sparse thicklewort. These were all dislocated farmers, he thought. Scanning the cargo hold, he assessed maybe 40 to 50 individuals, including children. Then he remembered his sprint through the prominent crops of unknown flora, noting that they were growing far more on Raada than this group could consume. Within seconds, a faint whir resonated through the hull, and he braced himself against the wall in Kala as the ship launched into hyperspace. Audnone tossed and turned in his bunk, involuntary ducks and bobs to avoid being spotted by his pursuer's eyes. His mind saw the shadow of an inverted head peering into his new hiding place. The darkness congealed into a thick mass as the shadow opened its eyes, staring directly at him. "Ah!" he let loose as he shocked himself awake, only to find that Aretti was leaning over her bunk, staring at him. Hair hung loose under her head, inverting eyes boring into his own. "Ah!" he bellowed again. "Sorry, sir. Glad you're awake," Aretti said quietly. "Don't ever do that again," he said, waiting for his heart to stop racing circles in his chest. "Audie, for the last time, Aretti, it's Audie." "Glad you're awake, Audie." She slipped her head back and rustled above him for a minute before descending the rails at the foot of the bunk. "How long have you been awake?" Audnone asked, on the cascading end of leveling out his frantic breathing. "At least 2 hours. I've been reviewing some data, and 7 has been most helpful. And cooperative," she replied, almost cheerfully in his estimation. "Aretti, I am sure Side could provide you with a suitable workstation on this vessel. You don't need to remain at my side," Audnone said through a brief yawn as he spun on his backside and planted his feet on the cool decking below. Resting his elbows on his thighs, he looked down at his feet as beads of sweat dripped from the forehead. The brief interlude of cold steel at his feet was fleeting as his mind convinced the rest of his body that it was still far too hot for any level of comfort. "I am sure you are correct, Audie. I just wanted you to be the first one I tell if I find anything." "My endearing Aretti, I had better be the first one you tell," he laughed his response, pinching at the skin between his eyes. "On that note, 7 has helped me understand this fleet a little better. Captain Evan Side, graduate of Kino." She paused as she moved over to the small desk that wasn't much wider than her datapad. "Sir, Audie, what is Kino?" 7 was unresponsive to that particular query, and I can find no record of it anywhere. Audnone rocked back momentarily, squinting his eyes in thought. Kino. He repeated a few times in whisper. Imperial relocation facility some years back. Assisted displaced force sensitives and their families. Part of a broader Project Deborah, if memory serves. He responded, disregarding his discomfort outright in favor of the work so quickly presented. Project Deborah, Already repeated as she feverishly tapped away at the pad in her hand. No record of that either. 7? She asked the air, turning her head slightly upward. My files are limited in that regard, ma'am, came a modulated response. Audenholm lifted an eyebrow in genuine surprise. The inquiry should have yielded a generic response at least, he thought. Immediate skepticism gripped him firmly. Data wipes? What would be the point if some remember? He turned his attention to Already fully and touched his mouth, beckoning for silence. He then made several hand gestures with his right hand, Already nodding her understanding. She followed his lead, snapping off a trail of her own hand gestures, motioning an in and out pattern with index and middle fingers pressed together, tapping her lips. I am sure they see, but they can't understand. Audenholm nodded in agreement, insisting on the highly informal communication shortly into their partnership. Can't ever be too careful, he mumbled to himself. After setting the datapad down, she flashed a series of patterns involving both hands. Expungement is simply a means for plausible deniability, Audenholm translated. Although the gestures only conveyed crude basic meaning to one another, the more profound meaning had been implied between the two for quite some time. He tapped the corner of his eye in response. I see, I understand. Unable to think of a better explanation, he tapped the corner of his eye. Kino, Simfar, Danth, and Igal, I can recall, were attacked, overrun, and ultimately destroyed by rebel insurgents a few years ago. To my recollection, there were no survivors, he said aloud, emphasizing the perpetrators despite his doubts about them. She nodded in understanding and flashed out another series of gestures. Rebels would not assassinate families, ever. I know, he said aloud again, gazing at hers. With that simple act, he had communicated his concerns, knowing that they were understood and, more importantly, reciprocated. He motioned with his left and right index fingers converging, then thumbed toward the door as he pulled his boots on his feet. Let's find out then, Audie, Already said with an unforced smile as the two stood and left the bunk room for the sweltering heat of the corridor and aft command center. As the pair entered the warmest room either had ever been in, they witnessed the largest conglomeration of organized activity they had ever seen collectively. Ah, Deputy Director, Miss Sigourney, welcome to our hive of knowledge, Captain Side said aloud with a head turned toward them. It seems your assessment was warranted, Miss Sigourney. Already looked around the room, noting well-known components of the IGV and others that were out of place entirely. A sizable holographic representation of a planet swiveled slowly at the far end of the room, looming large between three massive data screens, trailing text and image alike. Raada, she asked. The same, Side confirmed before motioning toward a human female with short-cropped blonde hair, a headset plastered to her head, and a loose-fitting informal black jumpsuit cascading her medium frame. Hung, your eyes, telemetry and optics on your mark, the blonde woman said. Hung? Audenholm asked outright. Shen Yu Hung? Again, the same, Side responded nonchalantly. Audenholm's expression reflected sincere respect and admiration, already turning toward him for some explanation. Captain Shen Yu Hung, decorated SD commander, following multiple near-impossible air-to-ground insertions and victories. The man is the best low-level commander to come out of Pressbelt. Already was a mad dash of activity upon her datapad, not wanting to sound the fool, asking what low-level meant. Her display recorded over a dozen low-altitude tactical configurations that should have been impossible with a Star Destroyer. Tagadataya is his, Side furthered the information, with a motioning hand toward the far left data screen. Already understood it to represent the assets at the captain's disposal, which were highlighted green. However, most of the names represented were highlighted yellow. Acclamator? Audenholm laughed. Genius! Updated well beyond Imperial regulation, mind you, but yes, Acclamator. Side responded in a boast, his chest rolling forward slightly more in his stance. Again, Already turned toward Audenhone quizzically, and Walker shook his head slightly. Used primarily for ground force deployment in the past. Enhanced subsurface shielding, reinforced hull armor plating, and enough armament beneath to scour cities from a planet's surface at close proximity. Audenhone laughed audibly again. Absolutely genius. Marrying those two together, Captain. Sai didn't respond immediately, his gaze centered on the holographic image. Beb, give me Harrel and Brucal in support low orbit. On it, sir, the blonde woman said with a hand over her microbead. Removing the hand, she continued into it. Kaj, Sullen, low orbit support, Brucal invert. Affirmative, Sidious. There were immediate responses over the cabin-wide comm. And TechNet to boot. Audenhone wasn't even trying to hide his awe over the fluidity and connectedness of the action taking place. The idea was not mine, Side commented, his gaze still affixed to the hollow image. Coupling hung with Tagada Taya. It was his. He finished, turning his gaze toward Audenhone. As the implication hit home, Walker was impressed, further than his imagination could have taken him. He turned to Already, knowing full well she would have had that damn bizarre look on her face again, but she surprised him this time. Granting the ship's captain choice of his charge implies trust in one's subordinate and optimization of the asset itself. She pursed her lips and nodded, a slim smile spreading across Audenhone's features. A hand playing at his chin, sidestepped closer to the blonde woman. Bev, ground zero, that heat signature, and give me full radial sweep 100 clicks out. Copy that. Hung? Bev asked. On it, the reply was again immediate. An explicit rendition of the responding captain's voice without any of the modulated static Audenhone expected. For Audenhone's benefit, Side offered a hand forward toward the hollow image as it displayed real-time deployment. Small orange squares fanned out from the large red circle, presumably the Tagada Taya, Walker thought. The central data screen snapped to view, displaying widespread fires, catastrophic damage, and debris within every pixel. We are seeing what Hung is seeing presently, Side informed them. Audenhone walked forward slowly, taking in the scope of the damage displayed before him, and affirming sound footing amongst the cables and wires splayed across the floor. The closer Hung got to the damage, the more details emerged. Scorched armor, devastated dwellings, and crashed TIE fighter debris, all surrounded by burning crops of some sort. The TACnet crackled to life. Sir, radial teams are reaching the terminus of parameters. Readings conflict between ion trace, plasma trail, coax elements, and hydranium contrail. Elements at signal traces both imperial and non. Team 3 on screen. The voice proclaimed, quick, concise, and measured. Hung, Audenhone knew. The center screen resolved to display several depressions in the ground, symmetrical and unnatural. The ground atop them fresh and dark even in the artificial illumination of the cam trooper's headlamp. Graves, a younger man acknowledged. Audenhone scanned the crew to find the voice's source. Reddish hair, a smooth complexion, and knowing eyes shone toward the ship's captain. Side nodded in acknowledgement. Identify, trooper, Side spoke into the TACnet link. Arlen Core. Pretty sure Prit is correct, sir. Exhume? The video display shifted as the trooper spoke. Non-designation identity? Surely Side can't remember everyone's name, Audenhone thought, glancing at Already, who only threw her hands up slightly. Arlen, yes please, Side responded. Copy, sir. Ground zero, sir, Hung updated his commander. The right screen displayed ground-level inspection teams extinguishing fires and tooling smoldering metal. This was one hell of a battle, sir. No survivors, I would wager. Another voice entirely chimed in over the TACnet. Ion trace, plasma wake, and hydranium contrail would prove otherwise, trooper. Someone exited very much intact and in one hell of a hurry, Side disagreed. Sir, Arlen, fresh graves. The initial trooper informed everyone, their attention returning to the center screen. The body looked like it had just gone to sleep, its complexion still supple and full of color. The uniform was that of a naval lieutenant, pristine save for the blaster scorch and accompanying hole in his chest. His arms were crossed over one another. Edges of the dig site are hard as duranium, sir. This must have taken some time, or with many hands. Fiber sample? Arlen asked. Adenhone began to wonder what sort of trooper specialized in forensic sciences. Yes, please, Arlen, Side answered with a hand on his hip, the other playing with the stubble at his chin. Already arrived at Adenhone's side as they both watched the trooper cut a small swatch of lieutenant's uniform away from the mortal wound. What the hell is going on here? They both heard Side comment. Spinning in unison to see, he had crossed his arm across his chest, propping up the other as he wiped at his mouth, obliviously deep in thought. My question precisely, Adenhone thought, returning his gaze to the central screen as Arlen panned his cam to reveal 13 more fresh graves.